What if some of the most influential letters in the New Testament weren't actually written by who we think they were? Let's dive into one of early Christianity's most fascinating literary mysteries. So here's how we're going to tackle this. We're going to put on our detective hats. First, we'll lay out the puzzle itself. Then, we'll zero in on a prime suspect. After that, we'll examine the verbal fingerprints they left behind and their potential agenda, before, bringing in a digital detective to wrap things up.
All right, so our whole investigation kicks off with a few key documents right at the heart of the Christian tradition, the letters to Timothy and Titus. Now, people often call them the pastoral epistles. Why? Because they're written to pastors, or you could say shepherds, of these early church communities, giving them the lowdown on how to lead. We're talking about 3 short but really personal and authoritative letters. They're packed with instructions on church leadership, some pretty stark warnings against false teachings, and a lot of personal encouragement.
And for centuries, literally centuries, everyone just accepted that they were written by the Apostle Paul kind of late in his life to his most trusted guys on the ground. That's the story that's been passed down. Yeah, what if it's not that simple? For more than 100 years now, scholars have been raising some serious red flags. The language, the style, the historical setting, something about it all just doesn't quite line up with the Paul we think we know from all his other letters.
Okay, so the thing to get here is that the case against Paul isn't just based on one little thing. It's a whole pile of evidence. We've got this vocabulary and a really formal style that feels, just different from the fiery, sometimes chaotic energy you get in letters like Galatians or Corinthians. And on top of that, these letters lay out a church with this really specific formal hierarchy. You've got your bishops, your elders, your deacons, and that whole setup feels way more developed than the more free-flowing, charismatic communities Paul was starting a whole generation earlier.
So if the evidence is pointing away from Paul, it has to be pointing somewhere, right? And that brings us to this really important figure from the very next generation of Christian leaders. And that, right there, is the million-dollar question for investigation. If Paul didn't write these letters, who did? And maybe more importantly, why would they write them in his name?
Well, there's a really compelling theory that points to a man named Ignatius. He was the bishop of Antioch way back in the early 2nd century. He was a huge deal, a major church leader. And lucky for us, his own letters survived, which gives us something fascinating to compare.
Okay, so what's the motive? Why would a guy like Ignatius write under a fake name? The answer in one word is authority. By writing in Paul's name, he could basically give the apostles' giant stamp of approval to his own vision for the church. And that vision was all about a strong, top-down hierarchy led by a bishop, which he thought was the best way to fight what he saw as really dangerous heresies. Now, if this theory is right, it bumps the creation of these letters from the 60s CE all the way to the turn of the 2nd century.
And now for the good stuff, the hard evidence. Every author has a kind of unique verbal fingerprint, and if we analyze the words themselves, we can uncover some pretty remarkable clues.
306. Just remember that number. That's how many words are used in the pastoral epistles that you just don't find anywhere in Paul's 7 undisputed letters. That's not just a small difference, that's a huge statistical anomaly.
And here's the real kicker. These unique words aren't just random. They are the common language of Christian writers in the early 2nd century, which is exactly the time and place of our guy Ignatius of Antioch. In this kind of textual analysis, these one-off words have a fancy name, hapax legomena. Now, having a few is totally normal, but when you see a big cluster of them, like we do in the pastorals, that's a major red flag for scholars. It really suggests a different person was holding the pen. Let's get specific for a second. Take the word eusebia, which means godliness. It's all over the pastorals and Ignatius's letters, but you'll hardly ever see it in Paul's authentic work. Or the idea of hypomone, or endurance. It takes on this really specific, almost military flavor in both the pastorals and Ignatius. And maybe the biggest smoking gun of all is the term episkopos, or bishop. In Paul's letters, it's kind of a general mention, but in both the pastorals and Ignatius's writings, it's a fixed, top-tier office in a very detailed chain of command. The fingerprints, they're really starting to look like a match.
But the connections go way deeper than just a few words here and there. When you zoom out and look at the big picture, the main ideas, the things they're really worried about, it starts to look like the pastoral epistles and the letters of Ignatius were written in the exact same world.
And this, right here, is where you see the biggest difference. Paul's communities, they were fluid, kind of messy, led by the Spirit through all these different roles like prophets and teachers. But the world of the pastorals and Ignatius is all about structure. It's a top-down system with one single bishop calling the shots. This was a massive change, and it's a vision that both of these sources push for relentlessly.
And it doesn't even stop there. Both are totally obsessed with guarding the deposit of sound doctrine. Both are constantly on a heresy hunt. And in both of them, the actual meaning of the word faith starts to change. It goes from meaning this radical trust in God to meaning the body of correct teachings you have to believe. It's like they're a perfect mirror image of each other's priorities.
Okay, for our final piece of evidence, we're going to pivot from ancient manuscripts to modern computers. There's this field called stylometrics, and it uses computational analysis to measure and compare writing styles with honestly incredible precision. So you'd think, right? The linguistic links are super strong, the shared agenda is undeniable, it really seems like we've found our guy. But this is where the story takes a really fascinating twist.
Yeah, our digital detective ends up making things a bit more complicated. It reveals a nuance that you'd probably miss just reading these texts side by side.
So check this out. The computer analysis confirms. Yep, the pastorals almost certainly were not written by Paul. But, and this is the wild part, it also finds that Ignatius's own letters are a better imitation of Paul's style than the pastorals are. What does that suggest? That Ignatius was a master at channeling Paul's voice when he wanted to. So, where does that leave us? It points to something called the same circle theory. Maybe the pastorals weren't written by Ignatius himself, but by someone in his crew, a close associate. Perhaps they were meant as more of a formal handbook for churches, or maybe even by his contemporary, another church leader named Polycarp of Smyrna.
So the real takeaway here isn't necessarily about pinning the crime on a single individual. The overwhelming evidence, the words, the theology, the computer data, it all places these letters firmly in one specific time and place. The world of early 2nd century Christianity in Asia Minor, a world that was grappling with heresy and trying to forge a new structure just to survive.
And that leaves us with a final and pretty provocative question to think about. This whole investigation, it's not just about who wrote what. It forces us to ask much bigger questions about how sacred texts even come to be, and how faith changes and adapts to face new challenges. It shows us that behind these ancient letters lies a really dynamic and very human story.